We're going to talk about water first thing this afternoon. Of course, you can't really talk about natural resources policy on the arid western public lands without talking about water, and so not surprisingly, the Public Land Law Review Commission had a chapter devoted exclusively to water issues concerning the public lands. And to address this topic, we have a tremendously qualified panel of experts here. It's good to see them. We welcome them. We first have Ann Castle and welcome her back to her home state of Colorado. Of course, Ann is currently Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Water and Science in the current administration. In that capacity, she oversees water and science policy for the administration and has specific responsibility for the Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Geological Survey. She's well established in this area, as we all know. She's practiced some 28 years with Holland and Hart, where she chaired the firm's Natural Resources Law Department before joining the Interior Department, and she also hails from this law school. We also welcome Justice Greg Hobbs, who, of course, was appointed to the Colorado Supreme Court by Governor Romer in 1996. Justice Hobbs has written and spoken extensively on Western water issues. He's the co-convener of the Western Water Judges Educational Project, Dividing the Waters, providing guidance to judges across the West on water topics, and is also the vice president of the Colorado Foundation for Water Education, and is widely published both in terms of water policy to poetry on water and other subjects, which we enjoy reading. And Greg also is a member of the advisory board of the Natural Resources Law Center, and it's great to have him and his contributions at our meetings and for our programs. The third panelist is Sarah Bates. Good to have her back as well. Sarah is also a graduate of the school. In fact, we were in the same law school class many years ago, far too many for me to recall. She's up in Montana now, and Sarah was Associate Director of the Natural Resources Law Center for several years, and she's written and spoken extensively on water and a whole range of natural resource and environmental topics over the years. She's currently with the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy at University of Montana, and also has an active legal consulting business. So with that introduction and welcome, let's launch right into this. The format that we're going to follow is I'm going to try and briefly summarize the recommendations, in some cases quoting verbatim, the recommendations that the Public Land Law Review Commission made in the area of water resources. Then we're going to ask each of the panelists to give some comments on a specific area, and I think as you'll see, the comments sort of broke down into three different areas of the Commission. Then we are going to have a little more free-form discussion and have general commentary on whether the Commission hit the mark, missed the mark, whether the test of time has proven up their assumptions, whether some of their recommendations have been adopted or not. And we'll throw it open to questions and audience discussion at that point too. Okay, so in the report, the Commission noted at the outset in the water chapter that federal lands are the source of most of the water in the western states. The lands in the mountainous areas, primarily Forest Service and park lands, are the source of much of the runoff that feeds the western water economy. And even further down on BLM lands, those lands can greatly influence water quality. And so there was quite a bit of emphasis in the report about the economic importance of water yield, the investment in water storage facilities, the dependence on irrigation, on water from public lands, the consumption of water by the rapidly growing urban areas of the American West, and also hydropower needs for water. There was, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly given the times, not much mention of non-consumptive uses of water for recreation and similar purposes. And so what the Commission did was they focused, this wasn't a report on water, they focused their consideration of water to only those water issues that had a direct relationship to public land policy. And so the three specific areas they focused on were the implied Federal Reserve water rights doctrine, given that public land withdrawals and reservations serve as the basis of that doctrine, watershed protection and management programs, again, given the contribution of public land watersheds to water quality and water yield, and finally on the impacts of public lands on water project planning and operation. So turning to the first of those areas, the Federal Reserve water rights doctrine, and as they called their recommendation, the limitation of the reservation doctrine. The Commission noted that in the disposition era, starting in the 1860s, the homestead laws and such, disposition of the public domain carried no water rights. And so there really weren't many water issues coming up on the public lands. However, in the 1890s, around the turn of the century, there started being a number of public land reservations for specific federal purposes, including national forests, national parks, and national wildlife refuges. But even then, as the Commission noted, federal agencies largely met their water needs programmatically through application for state law-based water rights. There was discussion of the seminal prior appropriation doctrine, which the Commission noted provided a great deal of certainty to water users and communities in the West and enabled the development of water and of population in the West. But then came the decisions in 1955 in the Pelton Dam case and in 1963 in Arizona versus California. And the impact of those decisions, as the Commission noted, was that it became clear to everybody, and everyone was put on notice, that federal public land reservations carried implied reserved water rights. And after those decisions, some federal agencies began to take the position that they were not going to rely solely on state law anymore for their water needs. They were going to rely on federal law and reserve water rights. And the Commission noted a great deal of apprehension in the western states regarding the applicability of this reserve rights doctrine, the disruption of traditional water rights priorities, and the potential destruction of what were considered up to then to be vested rights to water without compensation. So with this first recommendation, you can see the Commission recommended not the abolition of the reserve water rights doctrine, but its limitation, that it should be clarified and limited through congressional legislation in the ways that you see, that the amounts claimed should be formally established, that the procedures for contesting the claims should be provided for, that future reservations would have to have an express reservation of water, not just an implied one, and that compensation should be awarded where interference would result to claims that were valid under state law before the decision in Arizona versus California. A more specific recommendation. They had four specific recommendations regarding this limitation issue. They were willing to give federal agencies at a reasonable amount of time to essentially determine their water needs on federally reserved lands and essentially quantify and give public notice of those needs, and any needs that arose beyond those needs could not be asserted in the future. A procedure should be established, according to the Commission, for administrative or judicial determination of the reasonableness of the quantity claimed and the validity of the rights. Two other recommendations, that, again, future withdrawals and reservations would have to have a statement of prospective water requirements as well as an express and not just an implied reservation of water rights. And finally, compensation should be paid where application of the reserved water rights doctrine would interfere with water rights that were vested under state law prior to Arizona versus California, which again was the first time that the Commission felt people were put on notice that federal reservations carried implied reserved water rights. Now, interestingly, the recommendation regarding administrative procedures had the assumption that the McCarran Amendment did not provide a suitable means of getting that quantification and determination and consideration done. And we may have some further things to say about that. Okay, the next area addressed by the Commission was watershed protection. And the Commission noted that really the watershed protection programs that the federal government had at the time were designed primarily for flood control, but in fact they were conflicting. In some instances, there was a desire to decrease the water yield. In other instances, there was a desire to increase the water yield. And so the practices which were designed to control erosion, floodwater, and sediment damage on public land watersheds, the Commission felt that there was little evidence of the benefits of these programs. And so what they recommended here is that the public land agencies should study and prepare a report on the objectives, practices, and the demonstrated effect of existing watershed programs. And based on that information, that Congress should establish specific goals for watershed protection, provide for preferences among them, and importantly, fund them. There were a number of other more specific recommendations regarding watershed protection, and I'm just going to go quickly through these slides in the interest of time. The concern underlying this is that really watershed protection should only be a purpose for acquisition or retention of federal lands in and of itself, where you were talking about critical watershed lands. And so there was no great need to acquire lands for the sake of watershed unless you had such a critical purpose. And in these next few slides, I think you can see that concept reflected here. Again, federal land acquisition as a dominant control technique is not necessary. And so in this instance, this specific recommendation was that acquisition of lands for watershed protection should be restricted not just to critical watershed lands, but those within the boundaries of existing national forests, not unduly impacting privately owned lands. Okay, and then the final major area that the Commission focused on was recognition of public land values. And the Commission noted in this area that federal water development projects that were constructed by the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as non-federal projects that were licensed by the Federal Power Commission, now FERC, had important impacts on public land uses and public land values. And the basic statutory charters for the Bureau of Reclamation and Corps programs were really key to water resources development and the goals and objectives of the development side of things, and not on the impact, particularly to public lands. And so what the Commission provided for was that where there's a federally authorized water development project on public lands, it needs to be planned and managed in a manner that gives due regard to the values of those public lands. And the specific recommendation was that the Bureau and the Corps needed to expressly consider in planning and carrying out their programs and in project justification reports for new projects that specific potential impacts to public land values could occur from those projects, so that Congress could be informed regarding those potential impacts before fully authorizing projects. And in the area of non-federal projects, the Commission recommended that the Federal Power Act and the Federal Power Commission and FERC should clearly recognize that public land values need to be considered in determining whether a project will be best adapted to a comprehensive river basin development plan. Now, at the time, there was legislation that provided for extensive development of river basin plans, which really didn't take off beyond one or two plans. Secondly, the Commission recommended that conditions designed to protect not just values on reserved public lands under existing law, but values on all public lands, including public domain lands, be considered when there was licensing of a non-federal project by the FPC and FERC. So with that overall summary, here's a slide I'm going to leave up here that sort of summarizes the recommendations that the Public Land Law Review Commission had with respect to Federal Reserve water rights, watershed protection, and impact of federal water projects on public lands. And with that introduction, we're going to hear from each of our panelists. I think we're going to first hear from Anne, who's going to talk about the issue of impacts of federal water projects on public lands. Then Sarah is going to address the watershed management and protection issue. And finally, Justice Hobbs will address issues associated with Federal Reserve water rights.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be back here in the law school. I graduated these 29 years ago from the old building, which was old at the time. So it's great to be here and see the new digs. It's wonderful. So as Mike said, we're going to start with the last recommendation that he reviewed first, the one about federal water projects and considering public land values and impacts. The recommendation in the report seemed to me to be a big leap. It directed that Congress require the Bureau of Reclamation and the Corps of Engineers to consider public land impacts and public land values in the planning and implementation of their federal water projects. It's very explicit, the report is, that it's talking about fish and wildlife values. It calls that out particularly. And then it's very vague about any other public land values, and you're left to speculate about what those might be. And we obviously know that if we're talking about reclamation and the Corps of Engineers, they're already considering water supply benefits and flood control benefits, because that's what they do. And if we were thinking about it today, I assume that we'd include in public land values things like recreation, wetlands, riparian habitat, aesthetic values, in-stream values, ecosystem services, water quality, those kinds of things. But those are not explicit in the recommendations or in the report at all. And so I think that shows that they were at the beginning stages of figuring out how to consider those values in federal project development. And of course, I'm sure you talked over the past few days about the chronological context of this report. This was prior to the passage of the Clean Water Act, so we don't have any 404 permit scheme that's looking at practicable alternatives when you're licensing a federal water project. And before the passage of the Endangered Species Act. And both of those statutes obviously injected a lot of public land values into the consideration and implementation of federal water projects. So the recommendations of the Commission were embodied 3 years later with the incorporation and approval by the administration of principles and standards governing federal water projects. Those principles and standards were first adopted in 1973, and they were intended to govern federal water projects and federally assisted water projects, so any project that got some federal funds. And those principles, excuse me, there were two basic principles that were adopted in 1973. To enhance national economic development, if you were considering a water project, it had to meet that goal, and to enhance the quality of the environment. Not real explicit about how the quality of the environment was going to be enhanced, but that was one of the two guiding principles in the first adoption. Those principles and standards were added to in 1980, and then they were completely revamped and revised in 1983. The 1983 document was called the Principles and Guidelines, And the P&Gs, that's what people refer to them as. The P&Gs that were adopted in 1983 are the ones that are still in existence today. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the ongoing and very recent revision process for the P&Gs. So the 1983 document was approved by then Secretary of the Interior James Watt. He was also the head of the National Water Commission at the time, the Water Resources Council. And it was the Water Resources Council that recommended the adoption of the 1983 Principles and Guidelines to the President, and they were eventually approved by President Reagan. The purpose that was stated in the 1983 P&Gs was to ensure proper and consistent planning by federal agencies in the formulation and evaluation of water and related land resources implementation studies. So focus on federal agencies, focus on the implementation of planning documents for water resources projects. They specifically applied to the Bureau of Reclamation, the Corps of Engineers, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and what was then the Soil Conservation Service, now the NRCS. And the P&Gs also focused on national economic development. They said that the objective of water resources planning was to contribute to national economic development consistent with protecting the nation's environment. So again, you see this theme of economic development on the one hand, but consistency with environmental values. The P&Gs have very detailed guidance on how to calculate the national economic development value of a proposed water project. And they also have some guidance on how to calculate what's called the EQ, the environmental quality effect of proposed projects. What they don't do is tell you how to net those two values together. So you calculate them both independently and presumably take them both into account, but the P&Gs are very vague on how you meld those two concepts. The emphasis in the 1983 P&Gs is on projects that are economically justified, so the economic benefits exceed the economic costs, and that are financially feasible. And by that, they mean projects that the project beneficiaries have the ability to pay for. So over the past 27 years, since the 1983 P&Gs were adopted, a lot of other benefits and purposes of water projects have come to the forefront. Things that can't be measured in terms of dollars and things that weren't considered in the 1983 document. Things like environmental enhancement and restoration, protection of endangered and threatened species, public safety, protection of life and property. And in the Water Resources Development Act of 2007, that's the act that authorizes new water projects for the future. Congress instructed the Secretary of the Army to reconsider the 1983 Principles and Guidelines and to come up with new ones for the Corps of Engineers. The act told the Army that water resources projects should maximize economic development, should avoid the unwise use of floodplains, and should protect and restore functions of natural systems and mitigate unavoidable damage to natural systems. So that process is going on right now. It's been expanded beyond the relatively narrow direction that was in the Water Resources Development Act in 2007. The Council on Environmental Quality is leading the effort, and they're really leading a multi-agency approach. It's the new revision of the P&Gs is intended to be much broader than just applicable to the Corps of Engineers. And there's been a lot of evolution since the original 1973 Principles and Standards. So in order to increase consistency and transparency, the administration decided in the summer of 2009, in what was already an ongoing process to reevaluate the P&Gs, that any effort to modernize the principles and guidelines would include applicability to not just the traditional water resource agencies, the four that were listed, but to the full suite of agencies that have water resources responsibilities. So that would include BLM and the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, EPA. These new principles and guidelines are intended to apply across the board, and all of those agencies have been involved in the CEQ process. You can find a draft of the proposed new P&Gs on the CEQ website, and there's a two-page or page-and-a-half summary that I believe is enclosed in your materials that kind of give you the key provisions and where we're headed. The two guiding principles for the new revision have been that they will be based on science and that they will recognize the role that a well-functioning natural system can play in water resources management. I think that's a significant evolution beyond where we've been previously in considering water resources development. A well-functioning natural system plays a significant role in what we're trying to do. So this new proposal reiterates that federal water resources planning and implementation should, 1, protect and restore the environment, so they put the environmental goal first, and 2, improve the economic well-being of the nation for present and future generations. So the 1983 standards emphasized economic development pretty much exclusively. This new approach calls for water resources projects based on sound science that maximize net national economic, environmental, and social benefits. One of the changes that you notice right away is that the revised P&Gs shift away from the earlier approach to project evaluation to considering both monetary and non-monetary benefits. The previous principles and standards, principles and guidelines always looked at somehow monetizing the benefits that you were calculating to see if there was a net national economic development benefit. Now we're looking at non-monetary benefits, and projected non-monetary benefits and non-monetary costs are included in the selection process for a project. So, for example, the monetary benefits might capture reduced damages measured in dollars for flood control, but the non-monetary benefits could be an increase in fish and wildlife benefits or biodiversity or ecosystem function. And conversely, non-monetary decreases in value, like destruction of habitat or loss of ecosystem function, those are also netted in to the evaluation. The new P&Gs also make an important shift from the way we've traditionally managed our floodplain resources. The decision to modify floodplains is to be based on evaluation of the services gained and lost by a proposed project. So only those actions that result in net benefits will be further pursued or recommended for construction. And for the first time, in connection with floodplain alteration, we're looking at and giving consideration to non-structural approaches that can solve flooding problems without adversely affecting the floodplain functions. So, for example, if the natural floodplain can serve the purpose of protection against floods, then we ought to be looking at land use policies and land acquisition instead of construction of levees. That's the kind of thing that can also have water supply benefits, because if we use the floodplain for what it used to do, and we don't build houses there and structures that have to then be protected by levees, then the upstream reservoirs don't have to reserve as much capacity for their floodplain purposes, and they can use that additional capacity for water supply. Those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about, and that's what the P&Gs in the revision would have us doing. They also recommend increased transparency and good government to protect American taxpayers. The P&Gs are intended to increase the transparency of the planning for water resources projects and the implementation of those projects. What we're hoping is that if we use the best science, if we involve all the right stakeholders, if we're transparent about the planning process, that will result in a more rigorous study process, and it will inform the authorization and funding in the future. Procedurally, where we are is new revised P&Gs in draft form were published in December of last year. They were issued to the Federal Register for public comment. And actually what was published was called Principles and Standards. This is the policy part of the document. It's kind of the broad overview. It's also anticipated that there will be an implementation component of the overall document, guidance that tells us exactly how to calculate these monetary and non-monetary benefits. The guidelines haven't been written yet. They are in the drafting process right now. But what was published last year was the policy, principles, and standards. At the same time they were published, the principles and standards were given to the National Academy of Sciences for their review. That was part of what was directed by the Water Resources Development Act. And the NAS is charged with considering how the revised P&Gs would accommodate relevant emerging national water issues and problems and promote better water resources decisions. That's what it's really all about, is promoting better decision making. The public comment period closed after 90 days, and the comments are available on the CEQ website. CEQ and the other agencies are now drafting those guidelines. The NAS has held a couple of meetings on the principles and standards. The last one that they held was just last month. The NAS review is expected to be completed in November of this year. And then, depending on the comments, the principles and standards will be revised again and proposed for approval. These P&Gs are, I think, an expectable but a well-advanced evolution of both the first set in 1973 and this recommendation that came from the Public Land Law Review Commission report. They provide far more recognition of ecosystem values, including non-monetary values, and they're trying to establish a uniform way of evaluating those particularly non-monetary values, quantifying them, using metrics. They are directed at federal agencies, but they have good planning principles, so they can be taken and used by any entity that is involved in planning a water project. I would think that the authors of the 1970 report would be looking with favor on this evolution of the principles and guidelines and the way their recommendation for the consideration of public land values has played out. The new draft is consistent with a sustainable water strategy, and a sustainable water strategy is one of the highest priorities of the Department of the Interior and the agencies that I oversee. We have a Water Smart initiative that is all about promoting sustainable water use. We have a sustainable hydropower initiative that is designed to facilitate sustainable hydropower development, low-head hydropower, in-stream development, things that don't require new large structural alternatives. Sustainability doesn't just mean that that water project is going to be there into the future. It means that that water project can successfully coexist with other values and not degrade them. None of that detail was articulated in the 1970 report, but I have to believe, as I said, that these are concepts and an evolution that the authors of that report would embrace. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. We're going to each talk about different ones of these recommendations, and then we'll have time at the end to all talk about how the report has played out. what's happened, what hasn't happened, and to have some dialogue. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back here. I feel very honored to be part of this panel discussion. In my few minutes here, I'm going to offer a few observations about the way in which the Commission talked about water and the public lands and watershed values. And then I'll talk a little bit about how each of those has played out in the years since. And actually, I'm going to go backward a bit, too, to talk about where those concerns have come from. So I'll just name my observations as I go, and they're not very many. I'm looking forward to the discussion with the group. First, it's significant, I think, that the Public Land Law Review Commission report recognized and gave emphasis to the public land's critical role as the West's primary source of water. The report included some insightful observations and recommendations about the need to link land use and water planning and decision making. It did, on the other hand, offer a pretty limited perspective on the many different roles that the public lands play in regulating water quality. And in, although they talked about flood control and water yield, the focus really was on providing water and on ways to increase yield, and whether that was something to be encouraged in the future. I think the report is, as many people have pointed out through this conference, it was focused on the concerns of the time, of the late 60s and up to 1970 when it came out. And we see this in the water section, especially with the emphasis on the different authorities between the states and the federal government. This is a time when a lot of this was being sorted out in the national arena with the passage of national environmental legislation, with recent Supreme Court decisions on reserved rights. There was a lot of concern about how authority would play out in water decisions, and I think that's reflected in the emphasis of this chapter. My second observation is that the report's emphasis on history was really necessary and important and a good contribution. And we had a little talk about that yesterday, about how much good, solid historical background was provided. And that was especially important in the water area. Although the term ecosystem services didn't exist back at the turn of the 19th century, or the beginning of the 20th century, this role was in fact crucial to the creation of the forest reserves and the original mission of the National Forest Service. As historian Char Miller wrote so well when he described the early days of the Forest Service and the concerns of the land managers, the agency was created in many ways in response to abuses on these public lands. And it was intended to secure favorable water flows by careful stewardship of forested watershed lands. The way Char Miller described it, in the first 50 years, he said, the Forest Service put its effort into replant, regenerate, and repair. In other words, the focus on restoration was right there at the beginning of that agency. In fact, in many ways, this original emphasis of the Forest Service is reemerging today. We're seeing management focus in the second century of the Forest Service with an additional mandate to respond to something that wasn't considered at all in the Public Land Law Review Commission, which was the coming impacts of climate change. So importantly, many different responses are coming forward that I'll give a few examples of. Not all of them are coming from the top down. Some of the very interesting responses and innovations are coming from those who work directly in the places that are most impacted. My third observation, as the Commission observed, public lands continue to play a critical role in providing water in the West. We heard this, Harris Sherman gave some numbers yesterday. The national forest lands provide a very large percentage of water to the western United States in particular. The national numbers range from 60 to 66 million Americans who receive water from national forest lands. Forested lands capture and hold snow in the winter. They absorb water from the melting snow. They hold it back and release it later when it's most needed during the dry periods. In the process of doing that, they clean the water. The wetlands and the streams and the riparian vegetation provide a very valuable filtering function. And the water flowing through national forests, of course, on the way down supports all kinds of important functions, valuable recreational activities. A lot of wildlife and plants are supported because of the water. And so there are all kinds of economic and non-economic values that are provided because of the water that's captured first on those national forest lands. Other public lands are important, of course. The BLM lands play a very important role because so much water flows over them on its way down to the main stem rivers, but the source water is mostly on these national forest lands. My fourth observation is that the Commission did not foresee climate change as an additional pressure, and of course didn't consider this as a variable in the public land's ability to keep providing this valuable service. But that was 1970. As recently as 2000, the Forest Service put out, this is a very detailed report called Water in the Forest Service. It's an excellent document. It synthesizes a great deal of research and comments a great deal on the management implications of that, and it doesn't mention climate change once. So although there's a lot that remains uncertain about how this will play out, there is certainly a widespread consensus that we're already seeing a lot of changes and that those will impact the national forest and other public lands and their ability to provide water for all the various values that they provide. I think we're having a session that's going to focus more on climate change tomorrow, but in relation to water in the public lands, we're already seeing changes in higher elevation snow lines, more precipitation beginning to fall as rain instead of snow, flooding and more erosion due to flashier, earlier runoff. And in some cases, we're likely to see more damage to riparian habitat, more sediment in the rivers, and possible risks to human lives and property from this. We are certainly seeing lower stream flows during prolonged periods of drought. And I can tell you, where I live up in Montana, we've had several dry years in which the rivers were flowing so low and so warm that fish were dying, and the rivers were closed off to all recreational activity. It had an enormous economic and social impact from already, and the forecast is that we're going to have a lot more summers like that, possibly including this summer. Of course, drier forest conditions are leading to more intense and more frequent fires. We heard a lot about that yesterday. And generally, the changes due to climate change are summarized as everything's going to be less predictable. We're going to just see bigger fluctuations in conditions, and we can count less on things remaining the way they were in the past. And of course, in all of our water planning, we base our predictions on how things were in the past. So that's a big challenge to us. And it will continue to be a challenge to land managers trying to manage to play their role in providing this water in the future. So I think it's important just to consider that all of our planning and management policies are going to need to take into account this unpredictability and build in a better adaptability and be sure to talk about the likely range of possibilities that we may see in the future and to point out this uncertainty. My fifth observation is that federal policy responses to deal with water and watersheds on the public lands, and especially in relation to climate change, there are many different policy responses proliferating these days. And we've heard we actually heard a good preview yesterday with Harris Sherman's talk. We've heard some talk about what's happening in Department of Interior as well. I thought I'd just summarize a few initiatives because I think they do mark where we've come in thinking about these issues at the very top. In 2008, we had a climate change and water policy brief. In contrast to this report, it was a report by the Forest Service that explicitly linked climate change and water and talked about implications for public lands. We've had several Forest Service chiefs in a row announce priority action areas that involve water and climate change, and we're seeing a number of initiatives, especially at the, in all the way from the top, looking at large landscape conservation, always thinking about water in the picture, and lots of different initiatives related to doing restoration work to maintain this important role of providing water. We heard yesterday that the planning rule in the Forest Service, the notice of intent for the planning rule mentions water and watersheds. I think we heard that it was 20 times and mentions timber once. So obviously water's getting a huge amount of attention and will be part of the conversation. Right here in the Rocky Mountain region, I think you're seeing the most innovative approaches to integrating water with national forest management. And I'm really impressed with what's happening here in terms of public education, research, and very interesting, innovative work with partners out on the ground. I think that the partnerships that are developing in this region are setting the example for other parts of the country. I know that they are. My seventh observation, as opposed to my last one, which had to do with initiatives from the top, is that local initiatives and innovative partnerships are emerging from the ground up, and they're likely to influence and shape these federal policies. Watershed groups have proliferated since the late 80s and early 90s. A lot of them have been studied by the Natural Resources Law Center right here since their emergence. I think they put out the first major report on this in the late 90s and continue to do good research on that topic. By the latest count that was reported in the Headwaters magazine of the Colorado Foundation on Water Education, is that there are over 3,000 of these watershed groups in the country now, and over 80 of them in Colorado. These groups typically organize around a specific issue, frequently focused on restoring lands that have been damaged by past activities. Many of them get funding from the Environmental Protection Agency, from its non-point source pollution program, Section 319. And federal agencies sometimes, but don't always, play an important role by participating in these groups, providing technical assistance and in-kind help. I think these watershed groups and the very practical work that they do and the way that they engage diverse people in fixing the land, they're a good example of what Terry Anderson mentioned yesterday, of needing to find ways that work. They have in many cases found ways that work to make the land better and to improve its ability to provide clean, abundant water in the future. But of course, these groups and the voluntary work that they do, they don't replace the need for strong laws and regulations. And it's always important to keep in mind when we celebrate restoration work that the best situation is to not have to get to restoration work. It's to make sure that the lands and the waters are protected in the first place. In other cases, cities and urban water providers are reaching upstream to work with public land managers to protect and restore the sources of their water. There are some interesting examples. Harris Sherman mentioned the Santa Fe Municipal Watershed, which is doing they're phasing in a fee program, which will ultimately, after it's finally phased in, cost about $8 a year for each water customer. That money will be used upstream in the national forest lands to do restoration work and to help protect their critical water supply. The National Forest Foundation is looking to extend. It's got some pilot projects using more voluntary fee agreements in Phoenix to do similar kinds of work, and they're looking at extending that in other cities in the country. Right now, there's an appropriation request pending that would broaden this kind of pilot project. Mike Anderson is involved in that, and I think that one's called the Healthy Headwaters Pilot Project Initiative. That's a really interesting program, too. I think these new initiatives are interesting. They're running out of time. I'm going to have to tie up with my summary. We can talk a little more about these initiatives in a moment. What I want to summarize by saying is that the Public Land Law Review Commission was insightful in what they identified. They identified public land's key role in providing water for a thirsty West. The problems they identified remain challenges today, and we have some new ones too. Today we deal with greater uncertainty and more challenges. I'm encouraged by the broader range of options that are available for public land managers and the increased number of partners who are willing to work with them to find creative solutions. And I hope and I trust that public land managers will pursue partnerships enthusiastically and keep in mind their goal statements. They need to replant, repair, restore, and respond. And I'll tie up with a comment that was, this is a Forest Service scientist who said this, and I just want to give his quote first, then I'll tell you when he said this. He said, "A national policy which, though considering the direct value of forests as a source of timber, fails to take full account also of their influence upon erosion, the flow of streams, and climate, may easily endanger the well-being of the whole people." That sounds like a pretty recent statement, but that was Forest Service scientist Raphael Zahn in 1911. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Justice Hobbs?
What a great panel. It's wonderful to see you back, Ann. You had a great specialty in groundwater law. You were on one of the members of the Groundwater Commission in Colorado, struggling with the High Plains aquifers and their dewatering and some sense of sustainability so they wouldn't be entirely mined. And I believe you were chair of the Groundwater Commission for a while. Is that right? Maybe you avoided that. Yeah. And thank you for the invitation. What a great panel. My job is to be brief and read poetry. So I'm going to go right to that, because I want to celebrate our watersheds, which is, the topic, inevitably, of Colorado. Colorado, mother of rivers. When I was young, the water sang of being here before I am, of falling sweet and soft and slow to berry bog and high meadow, and held me in her lap and cooed the willow roots, the gaining pools, and called me through bright dappled grass, and called me, "Oh, my shining one," and shaped a bed to lay me on, and played the flute so high and clear, and shaped the stones to carry me when I am young and full of fight, for roaring here and roaring there, for pouring torrents in the air. When I am young as mountain snow, and crag, and cleft, and cracked window, I call the greenback cutthroat trout. I call the nymph and hellgrammite. I call the hatch to catch a wind. I call upon the mountain track. I call the scarlet to the jaw, as morning calls her own hatchlings. Call Yampa, White, the Rio Grande, San Juan, the Platte, the Arkansas. So Colorado, mother of rivers. I was pleased to write that poem on the request of the Colorado Water Conservation Board to celebrate 30 years of the in-stream flow law in Colorado in 2003. A pioneering statute, the first in the West, to set up an in-stream flow program within a prior appropriation system. So figure that one out. It's about 3 years after the Public Land Law Review Commission and its report. Now, Sarah, thanks for mentioning the Headwaters magazine about to come out. It's at the printers. I'd hope to have it for you today. It's the Grassroots Headwaters. It's focusing on all the local watershed initiatives throughout the state of Colorado. And this is truly a revolution, in my view, from when I came into practice in 1971. And it was all engineers and water lawyers and the Colorado Water Conservation Board and people who had made a lifetime in the water profession. It certainly wasn't people out in the areas they live claiming their watersheds in terms of the devotion to them, the value of it, the idea that they can actually have a part of the decision-making process. And what is really interesting to me about this effort, when you read this magazine, it'll be up on the webpage too, cfwe.org, as the 22 headwaters and the 9 citizen guides are up there to be looked at and utilized. These are really grassroots restoration projects on the ground for what you can really do to make a change. Water quality, riparian habitat, restoration, rebuilding headgates, working with farmers, working with the old, I used to call them the soil and water conservation districts, NRCS. It really is a cooperative effort. And look what we've done in the urban areas in the Front Range to reclaim our trashways. Certainly they were. In the early 70s, those rusted car bodies and garbage and untreated sewage, and now we have this high-end condo development, the walking paths and the bike paths, and you know the story. The Colorado we love is always with us, and it's our job to help people and mentor them for the next generation that will get to have a play in this. But I brought the Interstate Compact Guide that the Foundation just published. If you take out the fold-out map in here, just notice, this is Colorado with the Platte and the Arkansas and the Rio Grande and the Great Colorado River Complex. 19 states, this water rises up right here at the divide of these 4 great rivers, 19 states in the Republic of Mexico. So you can see this reach of this great headwaters watershed area that we're talking about here. It's no wonder that Colorado's hatched so many water lawyers, engineers, water conferences, the start of the Natural Resources Law Center here, the Water Law Review at the University of Denver. We're a net exporter of water lawyers. And I'm proud of that. Absolutely proud of that. That's the way it ought to be. And this school has had a large part in that. Allison Flint, my current law clerk. Allison, put up your hand from the University of Colorado. Okay, Christy, she just went out for a minute. Christy Hankey from the University of California, Berkeley, my alma mater. Kate Ryan, one of my former clerks, also from Berkeley. I also serve on their equivalent board at Berkeley, as I do on this board. So it's a great intertie. California and Colorado, the 2 Cs. The one at the headwaters, the one downriver that we feared was going to get everything. And of course, the great compact here, state law, federal law, cooperation, founded on the Compact Clause. As you know, 1922 for the Colorado River, 1948 for the Upper Basin Compact, so that those 4 Upper Basin states, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, realizing now that they had a shortage after the 30s drought, right? Wasn't that evident? That when they divided the waters, they were hopeful, let's say, optimistic. And they were averaging the really good years and the really poor years. They weren't dumb. They went through the 1890s drought, and 1902 was only 9 million acre-feet in the river. So don't accuse them of not knowing what they were doing. They wanted to manage the river with their great reservoirs, Powell and Meade, to even out the supply, okay? And then, of course, the Upper Basin had to give 75 million acre-feet on a 10-year running average to get the deal, And so the Upper Basin ends up with a chronic shortage, at least 1.5 million acre-feet, not even including climate change. So we're already limited, folks. And in Colorado, because of these interstate compacts, we can only consume 1/3 of the water that arises in Colorado. We've got to bypass about 2/3 of it. That's just the facts of life we live with. Nature and these laws that impose scarcity based on the fact that other states and the Republic of Mexico, which has the top priority in effect, 1.5 million acre-feet at the Morelos Dam, get their share. Now, when the Supreme Court decided Arizona v. California, came directly out of this compact crux, right? I mean, because what did it say? It said basically that the lower basin had its 7.5 million acre-feet a year. Theoretically, the upper basin, 7.5 million acre-feet a year. All right, but the real pusher is the 75 million acre-feet on a 10-year running average that controls the compact. The U.S. Supreme Court basically said the Indian tribes and federal reservations, I think there were maybe wildlife refuges that were involved in that, have Federal Reserve water rights, okay? Not quantified. Well, that woke everybody up, right? We went through the 30s drought. That was a huge wake-up call to that generation that suffered the depression and the drought at the same time. So here comes the Arizona v. California. They finally get their allocations right. Arizona 2.8 million, California 4.4. Who has to give up water that's already developed? Okay, California has oversubscribed their allocation. 5.3 million acre feet. They've developed it. They've used it. They're entitled to 4.4. Arizona gets the Udall brothers and Carl Hayden to get them the Central Arizona Project, right? 1968. By God, they got it. Right? Just before 1970. Okay, so what water goes to, these reservations? Unquantified, right? And out of whom? Out of what existing rights? What is the implication for the future? Now, I was absolutely astounded reading you put them up there. Listen to these recommendations now. This is 1970. This is after Arizona v. California. Okay. The major projects are online, basically committed to Meade and Powell for the two basins. Now, this is what the Commission recommends. The Congress should clarify and limit the implied Federal Reserve water rights doctrine by formally establishing the amounts of surface water and groundwater that can be claimed, expressly reserving water for any future reservation, and compensating owners of state water rights for interference with their rights. What are they talking about? Remember what the implied reserve water rights doctrine is, 1908. It just wasn't implemented. Why wasn't it implemented? I think it's another great tragedy of our Native American policy. They didn't get the water projects, whereas the Anglos did, right? The 1902 Reclamation Act built water for the settlers of the West who had homesteads or other land that they'd acquired in fee simple, and the Native Americans did not get their water projects, okay? So this reserved water right doctrine kind of lays dormant, and then the refuges, the land management agencies then, apparently have some kind of water right. Well, what is it? How much is it? What is its priority? Well, now, everybody had to assume in the West that the priority for the 14 million acres in Colorado of forest land that was set aside would be the date of those forest reservations. 1898, 1902, 1912, 1915, whatever they are. What is the Forest Service going to claim? How much water is it going to claim if left to itself? How much water, Lois? Okay, but look, here's the concern that the Commission was looking like. They would want it all, right? It's just like the Reclamation Bureau in 1902 in the Kansas v. Colorado case. What were they arguing in the U.S. Supreme Court? That all the water in the public domain not yet appropriated, all the unappropriated water as of 1902 would be reserved for the reclamation program, right? The U.S. Supreme Court said no. There's a savings clause in there that says that state water law is preserved. All right, and then the court proceeded to have an equitable apportionment basis between Colorado and Kansas, and then urged compacts be developed as it went along in the litigation. Okay, so you get the drift here. How in the world did the Commission think that Congress was going to establish the amounts of water for existing reservations as well as future reservations? How did they think they were going to get enough money to pay the settlers of the West who had 1880, 1890, 1915, 1945 appropriations under state law for beneficial use, where the reserve right doctrine doesn't go by beneficial use. It's reserved out of the unappropriated water for the future, for the purposes of the reservation. Wow. What an enchilada to chew on. I think that the Commission was very tentative here. They didn't really know what to do. The idea that Congress would do this, they must have known they'd been joking, right? How is Congress ever going to spend the time and studies and do this? Right? So this is an executive agency type mission here from the federal land manager standpoint, is it not? How much water do we need, and for what purposes? Well, you know the whole story that employed a generation and created all kinds of conflicts, many which were acted out in the equivalent of this room right over there, you know, in the 80s and 90s. The court ended up doing this. The U.S. Supreme Court in U.S. v. New Mexico, what is that? What's the date of that one? 1978. Thank you. I got it right here. 1978. The U.S. Supreme Court says to the Forest Service, no, you don't get in-stream flow. You know, it was for production of timber and for water for the settlers of the West. The settlers of the West. Guess who they are? The communities, the farms, all these other uses. So the U.S. Supreme Court, now they did have 2 Arizonans on that court, right? Well, at least had Rehnquist. Now, when did O'Connor come on? She was on there probably. No? Not yet? Okay. It's hard to get my history straight when I'm standing right here. And now I have to sit down. The point is, each of these battles have been fought. I think they're behind us now, basically. The state courts have been very active under the McCarran Amendment. State judges take very seriously the fact that they have to abide by federal law when they have a reserved water rights case. Agencies can also get appropriative rights. The hard bone is that the in-stream flow rights have generally been consigned to the states under these state programs, so we still have tensions. We still have areas that need to be resolved. But I think there's a lot better climate today for many of the reasons that Sarah and Ann mentioned, is that we've changed as a people. And we value these lands. I can't imagine a Colorado that didn't have a third of the land still in federal ownership. Can you? With this growth pressure we have? I mean, it's just inconceivable. So a lot of great things were done for us in the past, and now we're working at trying to live in this. We have over-appropriated basins in Colorado, in the Platte, the Arkansas, and the Rio Grande. Whatever water's left for our allocation of the Colorado River is going to be high-cost water. It's going to be there maybe infrequently. In these torrential events, we're going to have huge droughts. Whatever infrastructure is built, it's going to have a junior priority. It's very sobering. There's a lot to work on, but the great framework is in place, in my opinion. The federal lands, the water off the federal lands. Colorado was essential to this conservation conflict at the turn of the century. Teddy Roosevelt came out here and convinced the farmers and the towns that they ought to support the forest watershed area, the creation of those national forests instead of the Homestead Act piecing them up. Because why? That's because your reservoirs and ditches are going to be located up there, and see them? They're up there now. And when you strip all the cover, the silt just goes into the ditches and the reservoirs. Whereas the forest percolates water out through the groundwater. And by the way, it's going to be multi-use, this BLM and Forest Service, for getting water to the settlers of the West. Therein lies 2 parts of our brain, beneficial use and preservation. Damn good thing we have 2 parts of this brain. And our Western heart.